Interview with Don Cox, former field marshal of the Black Panther Party and Central Committee member from Exile in France, 31st of March, 1992. Will you tell us a little about your background and why you joined the Black Panther Party?
Well, I was born and grew up in Missouri, and all those cornfields and whatnot. So I was really just country nigger, you know, not intellectual, not knowing anything really. When I arrived in California, 17 years old, 53. Of course, like all black people that grew up in the United States at that time, I was aware of the oppression of black folks and all the lynchings that we were hearing about every now and then at that time. And the Supreme Court decision in '54, sitting at the table with the uncle and aunt that I was living with, and he was saying that was a very historical decision that we were witnessing. You know, of course, at the time I wasn't capable of understanding the implications of what that meant. And soon after, Little Rock and all those events began. Now, out there in California, I wasn't feeling directly touched personally, but being touched as just being a black person there in America, and really understanding that that was part of me too. But it didn't go much further than that. Then you have incidents like the Emmett Till lynching, you know, that I felt very sensible about that because we wasn't very far different in age. And then the Montgomery bus boycott, and then the Freedom Rides. All these things going on, it just looked to me like things were really beginning to move, but in the South. And then the church bombings and the civil rights demonstrations that began. I had a little problem dealing with the philosophy of nonviolence. I just, at that time, couldn't imagine myself being spit on, abused physically without doing anything. So for me personally, at that time, I wasn't attracted to dealing with any nonviolent actions. Although the fever of the civil rights movement actually arrived there in San Francisco. And with all the bombings and brutality of the demonstrations was such that finally I reached the point I wanted to do something. So I joined the group that seemed to me like to be the most militant there in San Francisco, which was CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And we began to prepare and make demonstrations against real estate agents that discriminated against blacks and whatnot. First, we would send a black person in to ask for a particular place that was for rent or for sale. Naturally, would be refused, and then a white member of the organization would go in and naturally would be available to them. So we began to boycott and picket those places. And the Cadillac dealer, where in San Francisco at that time, 75% of all the Eldorados were sold, were bought by blacks, but there was no black salesman. So finally, with those demonstrations, we began to get some token advances. But I noticed right away, even with my lack of political maturity, that whenever, like at the Cadillac place, when finally they broke down and started giving jobs to people, it was always jobs from people in the community that was already kind of well off in the sense that they were, bougie, in other words. It wasn't the people that was really down and out that was benefiting from the advances. So I really didn't understand too much politically what was going on, but I just didn't feel satisfied, so I just started laying back. That was around 63, you know, after the Civil Rights March on Washington. And the thing that really broke my back was the 2 weeks later, the response was that bombing in Birmingham when those four little black girls were killed in Sunday school. and whatnot. That just blew my mind. I felt a total impuissance, what's the word, impotent, and frustrated, wanting to do something but not knowing anything. Really, I wasn't an intellectual. I hadn't done any reading. I didn't even know what revolution meant at that time. But anyhow, on my job, I worked my way up, and finally, I became the boss. As soon as I became the manager of where I worked, the owner owned several corporations. We were only one. I had meetings with him once a week to go over the books. The rest of the time, I was on my own. So once I got to be the boss, the director of the place, I knew I was going to correct all the injustices with my other people I've been working with all these years, get them raises that everybody deserved and whatnot. But as soon as I start talking about that, he starts talking about, hold up, keep the prices down, pay the minimum amount of wages, and charge the maximum for the products. So through this process of my job, I became conscious and aware that it was the system that was wrong. But like I said, not having done any reading, not knowing what the revolution was about, I didn't know what to do about it. But I understood fundamentally through my work that it was the system that was all wrong. And by that time, 65 had rolled around, Malcolm X, and I was hearing people on the street corner like Darren Warden in Oakland at the time talking about black and all like that, and things that I'd never heard of before. And it sure made sense to me, so I used to go down on the street corners every weekend to hear them talk. And the mosque opened up there in San Francisco, so I used to go every now and then to hear what they were saying and go by the restaurant. And this black consciousness slowly began to take root in my head, but still I didn't know anything, what to do or anything like that. Well, finally, a long hot summer started. Seeing Watts going up in flame on television, that really stirred up some positive emotions, Finally, niggas are striking out, I mean, it was based strictly on emotion, not based on any kind of political analysis, understanding really what all those implications were. But I felt good seeing people striking out. Then the next year, a policeman killed a young black on Hunters Point. He was about 11 years old, shot him in the back. So the youth up there started going out on riot too, and it finally spread into my neighborhood there in Fulton Street in Fillmore. Well, I was going to work every day in my shirt and tie, halfway bougie nigga at the time. So I wasn't really participating, but I was just out on my stoop, the steps, watching little young bloods running through the neighborhood getting away from the policemen, And then I began to hear about a group over in Oakland called the Black Panthers with guns. I didn't know anything about them, didn't know what they were talking about, but the word started going around a little bit. And finally there was an article in the San Francisco Examiner at the time and showed a picture of Huey Newton standing up there with a gun. I know that was mind-blowing seeing that. So I started asking around, but nobody knew nothing about him, didn't know what it was. And then finally one day I walked into the job and somebody gave me the San Francisco Chronicle, and there on the front page was a photograph of all the niggas at the state capitol with guns. Well, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I wanted to find them dudes with them guns. Because to me, with all the violence that blacks had been suffering from all this time, the idea of standing up and saying, we don't want no more of that. If you shoot at us, we're going to shoot back. That appealed to me. But I still didn't know anybody. But finally, I ran across a couple of young bloods that knew one person that was there in San Francisco that was part of the Panther Party. That was Emory Douglas. So we found somebody that knew him to get him to come and talk to us and whatnot. And we started buying Panther paper and studying that and everything. And so happened the first issue we got our hands on was one where there was an essay by Huey Newton talking about the correct handling of a revolution. And for us there in San Francisco, not knowing anybody, not really being into it, we didn't feel worthy of being in their company. We felt we put them in such high esteem So we started trying to organize and learn a little bit amongst ourselves what was going on. And then by that time, Newark was breaking out, Detroit. We felt like the war and the revolution was on, and we was behind time, so we was working to catch up. And we wasn't going to go over there and meet with those people in Oakland until we felt like we deserved to be in their company. But in the meantime, through our relationship with Emory, we got Huey to come and talk to our group. And we really held him in high esteem and everything by all the stuff that they were doing in the streets, facing off the pigs with the guns and whatnot. So it was a little funny meeting him and seeing that little pretty boy with that little high-pitched voice. He didn't fit the image of this bad nigga that we had, and he talked so intellectual that we didn't half understand stuff he was saying, but still that didn't change anything. But he saw how we was organized amongst ourselves with our guns and giving training courses to people on how to use them and whatnot. So at that time, that was in summer of '67, he started asking us to deal with anything that came up there in San Francisco where people wanted Panthers. So at that time, there wasn't the Panther Party as it was known. As it became known over in Oakland, you could get a handful of people together that could call themselves Panthers and nothing more. So some people in Hunters Point asked him to come over and talk to them. So he called us and told us to go deal with it. So we went and arrived and took our guns, showed people a few basic things, how to break them down, and talking about safety rules and all like that. And we started doing that all around the different black communities. San Francisco was small, but the black ghettos are divided up. There was no one central one. They were divided up in about 5. There was Hunters Point, there was Bayview, there was Fillmore, a couple other names I don't really remember, but they were split up. So we started going around to one of these neighborhoods every weekend with our guns and giving demonstrations and whatnot. And then finally, we reached a point where a few of us that felt like, okay, talking's enough, we got to get down with business. And about 3 of us, we found each other, and we planned a little operation, And it was successful. We chose not having any propaganda machinery around, we chose the anniversary of the date when the policeman had killed that young dude upon Hunters Point the year before. So people didn't really make the connection, at least the pigs knew what it was about. So we did our first action on that anniversary, September 27, 1967. Well, it was successful, so then we felt like now we can go over there and talk to the people in Oakland. So the next day, we went straight to Oakland, and we went by Huey's house, and David Healy was there, and a couple other people, but they was laying back, they wasn't talking much. And we went to a restaurant, just sitting down talking, and naturally we let him know what we'd done. He'd seen the news, so he knew about it. So, but to my surprise, he asked me, well, don't you think it's better to, rather than start moving, is to work first to get the means to get to organize and get to move? Well, I didn't expect that kind of a question, so all I could think of to say was, as far as we were concerned, you got to use what you got to get to what you need. But anyhow, that was the beginning of our relationship with the Black Panther Party, and that was in September of 1967.
How old were you then?
31.
How did you become a field marshal of the Black Panther Party?
Well, we didn't stop there. That was in September 27th when we did that first action. And then Huey went down, got wounded and arrested. That was in October. I forget the date. It was the 18th or 28th or something like that. And we had decided that, like the Panthers there in Oakland was, that we wouldn't accept that anymore. We wouldn't let them move with impunity on people that we considered our leaders. So we planned an action to retaliate for that. And it was also a successful action. And because of the things we were doing there in San Francisco, one night car came, it was Bobby Seale, David Hilliard, and I think George Murray. Maybe Henry was there, I'm not sure, but I know it was David Hilliard and George Murray was with Bobby. And they came down to the neighborhood where we hung out, and Bobby said he wanted us to join the party. And wanted to make me a member of the Central Committee. So I said, well, we as a group, we don't have any hierarchy structure, you know. Every time there's something to be done, the one that knows the most about it does it. He's the one that tells us how to deal with it. So I'll have to talk to everybody and let you know. But we got together, heads together right then and there, and everybody said, deal with it. So I told him, okay. So that's when our formal alliance became with the party. And because of my background with arms, I'm from Missouri, hunting, 1 meal a year coming from hunting. I had my first rifle when I was 8. So when the party thing started, I had an arsenal at the house. So being able to train people and knowing all the gun laws and whatnot, then people didn't even know that you could legally go down and buy all these guns and whatnot. I started dealing with that. So there was no, I didn't have a title yet. Then they had a meeting to get a little bit better organized. It was around the time when we were going to have the rally for Hewitt's birthday in 1968. That's when Stokely, Rob Brown, James Foreman, and all those people came out, and the merger with the Panthers and SNCC went down. Now, as far as SNCC was concerned, they needed to get some more legitimacy because we're taking the thing to a higher level than them, but knew us, the Panthers, we needed to get a hold of the national network. So that served our interests on that level. And so we had a meeting, and we defined more precisely, you know, the Central Committee at that time, you know, which naturally Huey, Eldridge, Bobby, David, Kathleen, George Murray, Emory Douglas, my side, and myself. And at that time, that's when I received the title of Field Marshal. But because I was still going to work in my tie and suits and whatnot during the day and doing those other activities at night, I said that to continue to be effective, I don't want that to be known publicly. So if you find any of those old Panther newspapers, you'll see that in the beginning, every time you saw Field Marshal, it was written underground.
Mm-hmm. What were some of your responsibilities as Field Marshal?
Well, frankly, it was strictly on the military level, you know, procuring guns and teaching people how to use them. Mm-hmm. And because a lot of people are still out there today, you know, I don't want to go into any more details like that, but it was strictly on a military level, you know. Mm-hmm. Handguns, to buy handguns in California, you had to go to the police and wait 2 weeks to get a report. So because almost everybody had been busted and whatnot, didn't have a right to handguns, I used to go to Nevada to buy them, because there you just buy them over the counter like cigarettes, you know. So I'd collect money and go there and come back with trunk loads of guns, you know, handguns. That worked all right until a bunch of Carter's brothers got caught in an ambush in Los Angeles. I never knew really Arthur was his name. And Arthur was the one that introduced that phrase, right on, in the party. All the time Arthur was saying, right on, right on. And everybody picked up on that. Anyhow, he got killed. He got a full blast from a 12-gauge shotgun, but before he died, he offed 2 people that ambushed him. And the pistol that he had was one of those that I'd been buying. So when they traced it and they saw the store records of all the guns that I'd been buying, they made scare headlines in the newspapers there in the Bay Area talking about Panther stockpiling guns. And there was even a black congressman in the State Assembly of California that was a bootlicker at the time. I don't know how he evolved. His name was Mervyn Dummerly. He stood up in the Congressional House and read into the record all the numbers of all the guns that I had bought, you know, as if it was a crime for black people to arm themselves, to defend themselves against all that police violence, you know. So my activities at that time really were dealing with things on a military level.
We often hear the Black Panther Party referred to as a paramilitary organization. Is this a correct description? And if it is a correct description, what was the structure and chain of command?
Okay, you see, in the beginning, because of all the police violence, when Huey and Bobby and little Bobby took to the streets with their guns, they concentrated on point number 7, ending police brutality and whatnot in the community. I mean, the program had 10 points, but that was a priority for us because of all the violence that was going on. So that gave it a more military appearance, and the fact that the gun laws in California permitted us, it was legal for us to be out there with those guns like that. So that gave us an image of being a little bit more audacious than we really were. We'd go off in them police stations with our guns, and it was legal. See, they couldn't do nothing about it. But when they started working on that gun law to stop you walking around with the gun loaded, that's when the Panthers went to the Capitol with the guns in California. And so in that sense, it was because of the military situation of all the repression and violence against black people, the chain of command of the Panther Party, the titles were more or less like a military organization, or like a lot of revolutionary governments in the world. Huey, Minister of Defense. I was the Field Marshal, David Hilliard was the Chief of Staff. But also, there was a Minister of Culture, Emory Douglas, Minister of Education, Masai Hewitt, Communications Secretary, Kathleen Cleaver, and Minister of Information, which was Eldridge Cleaver. So the chain of command...
What was George Murray's title?
George Murray, at that time, was the Minister of Education. I forgot about him. Masai came later. Mm-hmm. George Murray was the Minister of Education. So, because in the beginning, emphasis was put on point number 7, with the police patrols and all like that, it in practice, even though the organization was not a paramilitary organization, it really had, in fact, that function, that appearance, initially. But then after Huey had gotten busted, the few of us that was there in the Bay Area, we got together the next day, and we know with one policeman dead and one other wounded, they're going to try to put Huey in the gas chamber. We didn't know what to do, but we got to do something to keep him from here and sending Huey to the gas chamber. And immediately the Huey Newton Defense Committee was created, and Eldridge Cleaver, despite what he became later, at that time went to work, and from that, the pressure group to keep him from sending Huey to the gas chamber became the Black Panther Party as it became known around the world, you see. Started organizing, trying to get as many blacks together as possible, getting them guns. It wasn't a real well-disciplined organization at the time, because some people started doing a lot of crazy stuff, little cheap nickel and dime robberies and intimidating people and whatnot, but still it was growing like wildfire. And by April, that's when they assassinated Martin Luther King, and those 150 cities just burned overnight. And because our level was a little bit higher at that point, we kept people from going out and just doing spontaneous things. But there were still a few little things were down. But we more or less managed to keep it under control. But Eldridge Cleaver felt the need to move, and he really didn't have any military experience. See, he was the Minister of Information, so he just gathered up a whole bunch of people, and everybody was armed, and when they went out in the streets, riding around in the cars, I don't know the details. All I know is some police cars showed up, and shooting started, and niggas were running all different directions, And Huey and Bobby, not Huey, Eldridge and little Bobby got cornered off into a house. And we all know that history, they stayed in there for about an hour and a half with all that tear gas and everything, and they couldn't get them out, because little Bobby had an M14, And there was a little, just a little alleyway. They were on the ground floor. To get to them, anybody coming out that little alleyway, they're gonna get blown away. So finally, they just set the house on fire. And at that point, you know, they had to give it up. They had to come on out. But Eldridge, knowing how the pigs was, he stripped down naked. You see, he had been wounded in the foot, and he told little Bobby to do the same thing. But little Bobby, I don't know, for some reason or another, he only took off his shirt. So with all that gas, for an hour and a half with no gas mask, you can imagine the shape that they were in. Plus Eldridge being wounded. So they went stumbling out of there, you know. Eldridge, I don't know who was first or second or anything like that, but being wounded on the foot, he fell or something, you know. And little Bobby stumbling, you know, one of those racist police said, "He's got a gun," and they opened fire on him. I don't know how many times he was shot, maybe 50 times, you know. It was really terrible. It was just out and out murder, as everybody knows. And the house looked like Swiss cheese. All the bullet holes that went in it. One of those wooden houses, you know, with bullets just going right through it. But they was down on the ground floor, so in the house they really hadn't got touched, but they blew little Bobby away outside.
You left the U.S. and went into exile in 1970.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what the conditions were in the streets and within the Black Panther Party at this time?
Things had really evolved by that time. More or less, the struggle had left the streets and gone into the courts. Because frankly, after the campaign to free Huey finally reached the trial, and it didn't send Huey to the gas chamber, and Charles Garrett, who was a lawyer, said that he would be out in 2 years. All of a sudden, you got all this machinery that's moving across the country, and for the sole purpose of freeing Huey, keeping him from going to the gas chamber, and we didn't know what to do with it. And we were depassed by the events because people just overnight was moving all across the country in the name of the Black Panther. So we decided to go into retreat and started going into political education, trying to find a tool to help us deal with organizing all of that. And I've never known to this day where it came from, but the first thing that came out for us to study was The Foundations of Leninism by Joseph Stalin. And as far as I'm concerned, that was the beginning of the end, because that was the book that was used to turn the struggle, the emphasis from the struggle to the party. Instead of the struggle for the liberation of black people becoming the most important thing, it was the party that became the most important thing. Then the democratic centralism and all that Marxist-Leninist paraphernalia that most of the organizations call themselves communists was based on. But the so-called Central Committee, and I'm going to tell the truth, the Central Committee was David Hill at that time, because Eldridge had already had to go in exile in December. Huey was in jail, and Bobby had charges against him. But they were making decisions by themselves. You know, we didn't really have those Central Committee meetings with the democratic centralism where things were voted and then passed on down, you know. But personally myself, I didn't know what to do, you know. So I was going along with that, you know, because I felt that the party was the only means to deal with that situation at that time. But slowly, you know, in April, that's when the New York 21 got busted. And I made a trip back there with David Hilliard and whatnot, and I saw that the party had just fallen apart, you know. And because of the repression back there, David Hilliard, you know, he wanted out. He wanted to get back to Oakland the next day after we dealt with what had to be dealt with. But I saw what the situation was like, and I said, well, look, I'm staying. So I decided to stay there and start trying to reorganize and get the party put back together. And the bus had just gone down to New Haven. That's why we had met there in New York. And the party in New Haven didn't even exist no more. So I stayed, and they got on the first thing, smoking. Robert Bay was so scared, he sat up in the house all night with a pistol in his hand until it was time to go to the airport to catch the plane, you know, because they wanted to get out of New York. As far as they was concerned, it was too dangerous. So they went back to California, and I stayed in New York. And I started moving to get the party reorganized, you know. And then finally, the At that time, it was the fascism conference coming up in Oakland. We were working, organizing people around that, and using that as a mobilizing tool. So the party started coming back together down the East Coast. Philadelphia, New York, New Jersey, and then finally we got enough cadre where I could take people from different chapters, and we went to New Haven, printed up some leaflets and passed them out, held a rally, and opened up a new party overnight, because those people up there had been abandoned. It was necessary to work to start getting attention to their case and getting them out.
Is that why Robert Webb was assigned to New Haven at that time?
Well, no, at that time it was the dude from Boston. What was his name?
Doug Miranda.
Doug Miranda. Yeah, Doug Miranda was in charge at that time. I mean, we just took people from all over, went there overnight, and opened it up, and he was in charge, and it started with that. Now, how things evolved structurally, I don't really know, because finally the police figured out a way to get rid of me and cut my wings. I had gotten busted in Richmond, California, back in the summer of '68, because they had a riot, and I'd go over there to observe. Naturally, I never moved without my guns, you know. So the curfew was at 9 o'clock. They'd been watching me all day, the California Highway Patrol. So it was time for curfew. Me and a couple other dudes, we were going to go into the house. As soon as we get to the house, they came from everywhere and vamped on me, and naturally they found my piece. So I got busted for having a gun, and then they put charges on me being an ex-felon, having possession of a firearm, and that was another felony. I had been busted when I worked for the post office because I ripped off a little money from the mail, but I'd gotten probation for that. But anything dealing with the post office at that time was a federal charge, you know, and it wasn't considered a misdemeanor. So I was considered an ex-felon, even though I'd only got probation. It was very minor, something like $50, but that was on the record. So they used that as a technicality to vamp on me there in New York, being an ex-felon in possession of a firearm, to test some new law they had made there in Congress. So I was confined. I couldn't move anymore around the country. Because I was living in New York at the time, I could only go to New York, but the charges were put in California, so I had to go to California for court. So I could only go to New York and California. So when I went back to California for the court trial, they gave David Hilliard and his clique to take over back on the East Coast, because by then things were organized, you see. In the beginning, they was afraid to even go there, but by then, things being organized, they sent their people in to take over. I think Robert Bay went to New York and whatnot. And I'm going to trial and whatnot, and things are dragging out. But then the Baltimore case came down. They had found a police informer. I don't know what he was, an informer or what you would call him, but the police had sent him into the party, but he showed his hand 2 or 3 days after he'd gotten there. And they dealt with him. But because I was responsible for the East Coast at the time, when they came out with the list of the people they was going to vamp on, my name was at the top of the list. I received the word on April 16, 1970, which was my 34th birthday. So I got hacked, you know, I got hacked. I disappeared that day. Now I stayed there, you know, not knowing really when things were going to go down, but I went underground immediately. But two weeks later, at around 31st of April, they started kicking down doors looking for me. So it was at that time that I split. I'd already been working, trying to get people to go to Algiers to help elders set up the international section. Sekou Odinga and Larry Mack, they had been underground for some time, over a year, and they needed breathing room because there was no underground apparatus at that time. So instead of taking people off the streets that were needed for street work, it was decided that Sekou and Larry would go there, and my thing came down in the meantime, so we all went there, Sekou, Larry, and myself. Now, we didn't have no travel arrangements at that time. We weren't proficient in producing false papers, so Sekou and Larry had to take a plane. Unfortunately, they couldn't get a big one, so they took a little one, and they landed in Cuba. It took us a couple of months to get them there. But it was a coincidence. They took the plane to Cuba the same day I left the States. I arrived in Algiers on the 5th, and I think they arrived in Cuba about the same time. And it took Eldridge and I think 2 months to get them out of there. It was almost July before we was able to get them to Algiers. But anyhow, we all finally got together. But in the meantime, the government had given us an embassy. The revolutionaries in Vietnam became a provisional government. So they gave them a normal governmental embassy, and they gave us their old embassy as they had when they were the National Liberation Front. But in the meantime, Eldridge was leading a delegation of anti-imperialist forces to Korea, so he left. And so Sekou Larry, myself, Bill Stevens, and Connie Matthews, we were left there in Algiers, and we remodeled the villa to create an embassy with plaques out front and everything. And fortunately, we were able to get it together just in time for their return. They came back on Friday, I think around September 13th, and we had the official opening the 15th of September of the international section of the Black Panther Party. So my exile kind of was really a continuation of work. You see, I didn't feel like I was losing anything because, as far as I was concerned, personally, you know, I was at war. It didn't matter if I was in or out. You know, work was going to continue.
What kind of thoughts were going through your mind when you made the decision to leave the United States?
Oh, the only thing, frankly, that I was thinking about was keeping them from catching up on me. I wasn't going to give them the day for anything. My whole thing was to get away from their grasp. They was kicking in doors all over the place. So it was funny, you know, because I went into a disguise, and I had to go in the federal building to get a passport. Now they out there kicking down doors. The passport office is on one floor, and the FBI was on the next floor, and I'm right in there getting my false passport. And I managed to get it in 24 hours, and I got half, you know. But my only thing was to get away from them. Now I'm going to tell you also, I felt a little relief because the Panther situation internally had become untenable with David Hilliard and his clique. I didn't agree with the way they were taking things. The old emphasis about armed defense and whatnot, that was just totally squashed, and they were not wanting to deal with anything anymore that would attract attention of the police. And as far as I was concerned, that was not what the Panthers represented, you see. And I wanted to resign. I had written a letter of resignation for Huey, but I hadn't given it to him yet. Sister Barbara had the copy, and when that thing came down on me, frankly, I was relieved, because that allowed me to get out of there without being branded a traitor or a renegade, as they would have done in the newspaper, as they did with anybody that didn't agree with them. So I was able to get out of that hell there without them smearing me across the country with that newspaper saying I was a renegade and whatnot, and that allowed me to continue to work outside. So really, on one level, it was a relief for me.
Did you know what to expect when you left, and did you know where you were going?
Oh yeah, I knew I was going to Algiers, you know. Now what to expect? No, because I was full of illusions, you know. After all the times that I'd seen the film Battle of Algiers, I thought I was going to a revolutionary country, you know, where everybody was revolutionary and whatnot. So really it was a contradiction, because when I got there and started seeing graffiti written on walls and seeing the name Elvis, I didn't really understand what that was all about, you know. But the atmosphere was very good, because the OAU had a liberation committee where they supported liberation movements, and Algeria was the host country. So at that time, in 1970, there were representatives of struggles of people from over 90 countries there. So being within that diplomatic atmosphere, revolutionary atmosphere, that was very good and very positive. But contradictions in terms of the Algerian society being revolutionary in the beginning, didn't understand what was going on, you know. People loving the French and whatnot. I couldn't understand that after all they'd been through, you know.
Mm-hmm. When was the international section of the Black Panther Party established, and how did it come about?
Well, like I say, the official opening was September 15th, 1970. And it came about as the fact that the Panther Party had international recognition at that time. Really, there were some inegalities because of that, because we were considered the favorites of everybody. There was no liberation movement in Algiers at that time that had an embassy except us. Even the people that were waging armed struggle, you know, all the Portuguese colonies, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, and whatnot. Even those people didn't have an embassy. They were working out of apartments and whatnot. So that caused some resentment, you see. We weren't aware of it at the time, but the privileges we were being given, because people respected us for dealing with the beast from the interior. So that we were considered heroes, you know, much more maybe than what we deserved, and we didn't really realize it at the time. So we created a lot of resentment without really knowing about it. Like we just niggas off the street, we're looking for a place to have an embassy because they hadn't given us one yet. So we're looking around real estate agents. They show us a place that was big enough to put an office upstairs and we could live downstairs. So we rented it and paid a year's rent in advance. Well, we didn't know, but it turned out to be one of the most bougie neighborhoods in Algiers. But for us, with our standards from the United States, it didn't seem like that way to us. But we found out later that it was. So we needed cars. Well, if you see old French cars, R16 and things like that, they're the kind of cars that in the States we wouldn't be caught in, you know. I mean, I was driving a GTO with 450 cubic centimeter inch in there, you know, with 4 on the floor when I left the States. So driving an R16, you know, for me it was almost like a Model T. So we rented 2 of them to have enough transportation, but it turns out that was a car that everybody down there dreamed of having. You know, it was one of the most, it was one of the leading cars that you could have. So a lot of mistakes were made on that level from our part, from being just totally ignorant. But we needed transportation, and that was the biggest car that we could find, even though it didn't meet our American standards. It got us around. We didn't realize the resentment that created in other people's minds, you know, like having these 2 R16s, having the Vila and Hydra, and then by that time they'd given us the Vietnamese embassy, so we had an embassy of our own. So later I found out that people were saying, oh, they're not revolutionaries, they're bougies, they're bourgeois people. You imagine calling say cool, they just laugh back at us, they're bougie people, you see. But those were mistakes we made for not understanding the situation. But then too, we weren't like the people from the other liberation movements. They just sat around waiting for handouts. The government, the OAU gave every liberation movement 2,000 francs a month, 2,000 dinars a month to live on. You can't live on that. It was symbolic as far as we were concerned. We dealt with our own needs, you see. Elders used a lot of the money from the book he got, plus there were support committees working in Europe. So we dealt with ourselves without asking anybody for anything. And they wasn't used to people moving like that, you know. So that created resentment too, you know. We dealt whatever it was that we felt like had to be dealt with at the time. We're not in no struggle for people to tell us what to do. So on that level, we made a lot of mistakes on a cultural level, not taking into account the cultural differences, but we were ignorant to all of that. Mm-hmm. We was being ourselves, you see.
What were the functions of the international section?
To disseminate information about the party all over the world, doing as much as we could, being really the embassy and the Algerian government. We were treated as the official representatives of the American movement. No Americans came to Algiers or could leave without our authorization. If someone wanted to come, they would contact us, and then we would, if we accepted them, we would give clearance to the FLN, the people that were in charge of us, who would give the clearance at the airport. We were the official American representatives out here at that time, because the embassy was closed since the war in 1967. Now, we didn't know at the time we were also being used by the Algerians, because they were in secret negotiations for oil contracts with the American oil companies for the billions of dollars that they were going to use to build the future of their country on. So I'm sure that we were used as a little pressure in their negotiations, but we weren't aware of that at that time.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the spirit of the Black Panther Party as it developed from the view of the international section.
Well, as I had said, before I left, I didn't agree with the way Hilliard had taken the things, really using repression and creating an internal police force to vamp on anybody in the organization that didn't agree with their line or didn't agree with them. He just put him up as a little foot Stalin. He became the Stalin of the Black Panther Party. But us out there, even before I left, our hopes was in Huey. When Huey gets out, he's going to put things back on the line. So here we are in 1970. I think he got out in August, even a month before the international section opened up. And you have to keep in mind, when Huey got shot and got busted and went to jail, you could only get a handful of people together there in the Bay Area that called themselves Panthers. Panthers were unknown on the national level. So when he comes out of prison, there's not only a national organization, it's on an international basis with international recognition and hundreds and thousands of people outside the prison waiting on him. Although the nigga just flipped out. He just went to his head with that megalomania, being Huey Newton, you see. So in the beginning, everybody was just elated. It was just like Nelson Mandela when he got released. Finally, Huey's out. He's going to put things back on the line. But not only he didn't put things back on the line, he took the things even further than David did. Nigga gets a penthouse up there in Oakland, Cadillac. They start buying clothes. They get off into that cocaine. I heard they even put sisters out on the street. Them niggas just went crazy. Started dressing like Al Capone and a bunch of gangsters moving on. Dressing like Al Capone and a bunch of gangsters moving on people, using brutality against people, just became bandits. So we're out there getting little bribes of what's going on here and there, not really understanding everything, but we're not going along with that. We got an order that from now on, when you talk to international representatives or put out anything, Huey needs to be called the Supreme Commander. Well, for us, that nigga done gone crazy, calling himself the Supreme Commander. We ain't going for that. So naturally, we didn't do that. Them niggas just went crazy. Started dressing like Al Capone and a bunch of gangsters, moving on people, using brutality against people, just became bandits. So we're out there getting little bribes of what's going on here and there, not really understanding everything, but we're not going along with that. We got an order that from now on, when you talk to international representatives or put out anything, Huey needs to be called the Supreme Commander. Well, for us, that nigga done gone crazy, calling himself the Supreme Commander. We ain't going for that. So naturally, we didn't do that. We didn't follow those orders. We continued the thing, as it always was, the Minister of Defense, that we had to talk about him. A week or two later, we got an order changing the other order, saying, no, he's no longer the Supreme Commander, he's the Supreme Servant of the People. Well, we knew he'd just gone out there in left field, you see. And we started having meetings there, figuring out what we're going to do, discussing all the contradictions and whatnot. We were about 25 at that time in Algiers. And we didn't really know when or how we were going to deal with it. But what happened was, Huey had completely isolated us. Anybody caught communicating with us, I think maybe some of them were actually moved on. I don't know, but total communication was stopped. The only person who had a right to communicate with us was Huey. So we really didn't know what was going on. Finally, Huey called one night, told the elders that, look, word's going around that maybe we're not seeing things eye to eye. Now, I'm going to be on a live television show tomorrow morning, and we're going to call you, and we're going to talk on this live show, and we're going to show people that everything's all right between us. So they hung up, and when he hung up, that's when we decided, well, this is it. So we prepared a statement, and the next day they called. Huey's on live TV, and the speaker, they're just making formal things, hello, how you doing, and stuff like that. And finally the speaker asked elders, well, is there anything you want to say? And that's when the elders wrote the statement, where we denounced the direction that Huey was taking the party, and all the things that they were doing. On live TV, Huey was sitting there. That nigga went crazy, you know. And that's what broke the split out into the open, because we couldn't allow that to continue. We didn't want people to think that we were going along with those things, you know. So about an hour later, Huey called me. He asked me, well, what side you on, DC? I said, I'm against you. He laughed. Ha, 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 ha. Okay, I'm going to crush you. About three days later, I got a phone call from Seale in a panic, you know, telling me that Robert Webb just got shot in the head up on 125th and 7th Avenue. Well, I went into a depression for about 5 days. I couldn't even talk, so really, when he said he was going to crush me, he really got to me. You know, Robert Webb was a wonderful brother, you know. And Huey knew it, because he was such a nice brother that at one time he was Huey's personal bodyguard. You know.
There are certain events that happened in Robin International Section that also made news in the United States. Let's talk about some of them for a moment.
Okay, what about it?
The 2 airplane hijackings, the one involving the $500,000 ransom. Could you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, Roger Holder was his name, ex-Vietnam veteran. He had flown helicopters over there. He really wasn't affiliated with any organization or anything, but his personal conscience told him to deal with that, hijack a plane. And, he wasn't very political, so his demands weren't real clear in the beginning. He was asking for the release of Angela Davis and a few other demands that appeared to be progressive. And finally, he got a plane to come on over to Algiers and join us. And his girlfriend at the time, Catherine Holder, that was with him, because when he arrived, he was received as a hero in Algiers. Everybody's around him. I went to talk to his girlfriend. So I asked her, oh, hey, what group you with? She said, oh, I ain't with no group. I just came along for a ride. So that shows you what level that was on, you know. And, well, naturally, as I said before, we didn't know that Algerians were in negotiation with for these oil contracts. Naturally, they let the people into the country, and they became part of the group. But they gave the airplane back, and they confiscated the ransom money. But because blacks didn't have confidence in the news media, there were people in Detroit that
The $1 million ransom?
Yeah, well, see, those people in Detroit, not having confidence in the news media, didn't believe that they'd given the plane back and the money, so they decided to do the same thing. And they took a plane and came over with $1 million ransom. But by that time, the Algerians wanted to put a stop to that. So in the beginning, they kept us separated from them. We couldn't get to them.
That was the McNairs?
The McNairs and George Brown and George Tillotson, and there was another one called Nah. And finally, they let them get in contact with us. But naturally, they gave the money back. They gave the airplane back. But the Algerians, they didn't want that kind of pressure. They wanted to put a stop to that. So they created a very uncomfortable situation for everybody. And we knew by then, because the split had gone down and things were very tense there amongst us in Algiers, that it was time to get out of there. Now, after the split, the people on the East Coast, you know, including Sekou and Larry that were there in Algiers, everybody had decided they didn't want to have anything to do with the Central Committee. And being a Central Committee member, that meant me too. Even though they knew that I was not part of all that stuff that was going on, they didn't want to make exceptions. So they cut me loose also. So that hurt me pretty bad. So what I did, I resigned. And I was living out in the suburbs of Algiers. But because we were there as a group, I didn't want to cause any political problems with the government or anybody, so I didn't make it public that I was resigned. So I'd been living out there since January. And Roger didn't come into June, and the other hijackers didn't come to September. So I really hadn't been participating in any of the decisions. But by the time that last plane came, everybody just saw dollar signs. When I say everybody, I mean the others, not me, because I knew that they were going to give that back too.
When the takeover at Attica State Prison occurred in September of 1971, one of the prisoners' demand was asylum in a non-imperialistic country. How did the international section respond to this demand?
Well, we were very favorable to it. We personally didn't do anything because Bobby Seale was on the scene there. We didn't have communications really with anybody directly on the thing. But if we had been contacted and anybody had been released, we could have welcomed them in Algiers. We still had our diplomatic status with the FLN, and we could have welcomed anyone there. That wouldn't have been a problem.
What were the events leading up to the dismantlement of the international section of the Black Panther Party?
Well, all those internal dissensions that I was talking about. You see, that after that last plane came over, everybody just wanted out of there, and I'll explain why. They decided that they were going to make some kind of move and put pressure on the government to give up that $1 million. Well, I came out from my suburbs where I was living to be at the meeting, and right away I told them they was crazy. You know, the government's not going to risk the future of their country for a handful of niggas and $1 million. So they just told me to shut up. They didn't want to hear anything I had to say. I said, okay, y'all keep my part. Well, Pete O'Neill jumped up and said, anybody else feel like that? So I went on back home, because I knew if they did anything, you know, they was going to be in trouble. So I had a listening post set up where I had radios tuned in on all the stations, even local stations in the States, and tape recorders and whatnot. So I'm sitting there listening to this BBC News at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I hear a statement that they didn't put out, Eldridge and the hijackers condemning Boumediene and the Algerian government. So I knew he's done blown it, you know. Within 5 minutes, I get a phone call from Larry Mack saying, call New York, they got us surrounded by machine guns. So, but I had a woman friend at the house. Before I did anything, I got my guns, my ammunition, my stash, and I gave it to her and I said, get out of here quick. The bus stop was right across the street. And while she's still standing in the bus stop, the police show up at my house, because they didn't know I had resigned, you see. But they saw that I was there by myself. They searched that house for everything. Naturally, they didn't find anything, because my woman was standing across the street in the bus stop with everything in their bag, and she managed to get away with it. So they put everybody at the office under house arrest, and that night, I hear sirens coming again, and they bought all the hijackers and put them out there in my house to get them out of sight, and put us under house arrest. 2 policemen on the door. I could only go out and do shopping with a policeman accompanying me. Well, with political interventions with the president and everything, managed to calm down his anger for what they had done, and everybody was released from house arrest after the weekend was over. But for all technical purposes, that was the end. It was just a question now of people getting out of there. And unfortunately, that coincided with the time that I had planned to leave. So all the plans I put together to get out of there were blown away by all this house arrest and having police on the door. So I had to choose alternative means, and I managed to get out of there in September, at the end of September. So really, I was not there in Algiers at the time when everybody managed to get away and leave and go their own different ways, you know. But I went back in the beginning of '74, and when I got back, everybody had already gone. I went back as a political refugee, and because the authorities there had confidence in me, they had known me and seen how I worked, naturally they gave me political asylum, and even helped me get an apartment and a job. And I stayed there until 1977, all by myself as a political refugee.
When we left the United States and went into exile, the Black Panther Party was a flourishing organization with national and international support. Less than 6 years later, it no longer existed. How did it feel, and how did this affect you?
Yeah, well, it was hard, you know, accepting and realizing the fact that instead of Huey straightening things out and getting the party back on the road, that he was just taking it downhill. You know, that hurt real bad. So as far as I was concerned personally, when the split went down in February of '71, the party was over. The party, as it had been known, as it had become known, it was finished. Oh, they did all kind of little things, you know, trying to become legitimate political party, you know, and get support of the people, but really a lot of it was just to disguise all their criminal activities, you know. They become hoodlums, racketeering people and whatnot, you see. It just become Huey's personal tool. And it was over in February of '71 with the split. And that hurt real bad because all the comrades that had died and were in prison for the principles that we had learned from Huey and Eldridge at the time, that was a hard blow. So really it was like becoming an orphan, you know. It was like a lot of people with the communist parties disappearing all over the world, you know. It's like being like an orphan, not knowing what to do. Knowing that there's still stuff to be done, but not knowing what to do. So I had decided to continue the activities that I had been doing when I became the field marshal. So I just cut off all communication with everybody, and I worked to leave Algiers and go back in and join up with the people I was associated with. But unfortunately, you have this problem of survival. And everybody I know got busted sooner or later dealing with survival problems. So I arrived there in the end of '72, and by summer of '73, I was all by myself. But I didn't want to live there just to be living there. I was only back to continue to struggle. I mean, going to the store to buy food or buy a pack of cigarettes every time seeing a policeman, wondering if this time it's going to be it, if I got to go down. Well, I didn't want to go down just for personal survival. Going down for a struggle is one thing. I was there for that. But going down for personal survival, I didn't relate to that, so I left out again. And that's when I went back to Algiers as a political refugee.
How have you been able to cope?
Well, it hasn't been easy. There's one thing I've learned, two things. When War did that record, The World's a Ghetto, I don't know if they knew the depth of what they said, but really it's true. The world is a ghetto, you know. And black people are considered on the bottom everywhere. There's no exceptions. And another thing, Che Guevara said, whenever you're in exile, consider yourselves in enemy territory. Now, I had help in Algiers. Like I said, the government was very helpful. Helped me get a job, helped me get an apartment, and I was very, very well treated. But you got the problem of cultural differences, which were very, very, very strong. I mean, I lived 7 years in Algiers, and the last day was like a first. Whenever I went out of the house into the streets, there goes the American, there goes the American, you know. It just wasn't possible to integrate, you see, because I'm not a religious person, especially I wasn't going to become a Muslim. I had been told several times by certain officials responsible for the liberation movement people, you become a Muslim, all the doors will be open. Well, I'm not, I'm not an opportunist on that level. You know, I wouldn't make those kind of compromises with my principles, so I was just isolated out there all by myself, you see. And the cultural differences became so strong, the pressure became so great that I had to get out of there. Now, I'll recount a little, I'll tell about a little anecdote. It's funny, but it's tragic also. It was the African Cup football in 1977. The only thing standing between Algeria and Africa Cup was Guinea, the team from Conakry. And the first match was in Conakry, and the Guineans beat Algerians 2-0. There were some Algerians that attacked black people in the streets in Algiers as a result of that football game. The doorkeeper at the job where I worked, who was a black man, people came to work the next day talking about, you don't come to the stadium for the return match. And talking about me, now these are people supposed to be progressive people who've been to the School of Fine Arts because they're graphics. I was working for a firm, you know, doing graphic arts. Well, if he hadn't done something wrong, he would have had to leave his country. I left work. I quit work right then and there. That was in February, and I started moving to get out of Algiers, you know, that kind of atmosphere. I wasn't ready to accept that from a country that had suffered so much from racism as they had in France, from the French. I preferred to find some reactionary Western culture, because I'm a Western culture myself, where don't nobody care about what I do. Well, the only other culture I had learned, being in Algiers, was the French culture. All the other people, foreigners that I'd met, Algerians and French alike, were living in France. So I decided to leave Algiers and come to France, and that was in April of 1977.
How many Panthers would you say are in exile in various countries around the world?
Well, I don't really have an exact figure, you know. I know of 2, 4, 5, 6. I know about 12 personally, you know, but I'm sure there are others because it just wasn't possible for me to know everybody, you see.
What does being in exile mean in terms of the impact on your life?
Well, it means being cut off completely with everything you know, everything you love. All your references are completely blown away. Everything is new. You have to learn the rules all over again. Every place you go, every culture is different. Frankly, everybody has the same problems all over the world: survival, food, clothing, and shelter. And really, basically, the only thing that changes is the culture and the language. But some of the rules really coming from the America that I knew that doesn't seem to exist anymore, sometimes it's hard. For France, for example, here you have to have a national identity card. You always have to have your identity card on you. If you don't have your identity card, and if you're controlled, you can go to jail for 4 days automatically. Well, coming from the United States, where there was no national identity card, that's like Big Brother for me. Here, you can't do anything without first demanding authorization or registering somewhere. I remember when I opened up a photographic studio in San Francisco, maybe about 64 or something like that. All I had to do was go down to City Hall, pay $1.50 and register the name and pay my taxes. That's all I had to do. Here in France, it takes something like 3 months to create a company. 3 months of paperwork. And because they have so many social programs, Social Security, you know, medical care, retirement, and old age pension and things like that, the charges are terrible. For example, me working as a contractor, whether you work or not, every 3 months you got to pay something like $5,000 in charges to the retirement fund, the health plan, and things like that. So it really is hard here. It's very, 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 very difficult, you know. It's on a survival level, that's the most difficult thing. Being outside of my element, you know, I find the survival on an economic level the most difficult thing to deal with. Because my attitude has never changed all these 22 years I've been in exile in terms of the struggle, I feel no different about the United States on that level. I'm just hurt and disturbed by the fact that I see things have deteriorated to the point that it's 1,000 times worse today than it was when I was present and active with the rest of the Comrades back in the 70s.
What are some of the lessons that you've learned from the last 22 years of struggle and exile?
Well, for me, the fundamental thing for me that I've learned is the problem is the men and the megalomania. Every time you look at organizations and whatnot that try to get started, when they fall apart and everything, it's always because of the men struggling over power and trying to get over their own program, no matter what it is. And even when you look at history is nothing but that. Struggles of men wanting to impose their way of seeing the world or protecting their power and oppressing other people. History is full of that. That's one of the things I really try to get deep off into, studying history, prehistory, the evolution of man, trying to understand that phenomenon, to see what can be done to change that. Because every time the objective conditions today being 100 times worse than they were when we were active, what's the reason that there's not people out there dealing with the problem? Because of men. Every time people get their heads together, try to get an organization, you start having those megalomaniac struggles for power. That's the most fundamental thing that I've learned out here. And that, as far as I'm concerned, that's the thing we have to guard ourselves against. Anybody that wants to get organized, to get something moving again, they've got to create some means to controlling this tendency of men to struggle for power and their own personal aggrandizement.
What are some of the concerns that you have now?
The concerns that I have now is that terrible situation that we find ourselves in the United States. And really the recognition and the understanding that it's no longer just a national problem. All the countries of the world treat their problems as internal and natural, But really, it's an international octopus that's calling all the shots. International finance capital. I mean, we have to recognize the situation like it is. People in London are deciding the prices of the cocoa and the precious metals that people all over the third world are producing. People in Chicago are deciding the price of grains, you know, the wheat and everything like that. People are producing. Here at the stock exchange in Paris, they're deciding the prices of sugar and everything like that. It's out of control. It's out of control of government hands. There is no national solution to the problem. It's really an international phenomenon. Of course, much can be done on an internal level. I mean, it's a crying shame that inside a country, so-called the leading country in the Western world like the United States, you have all those people living out there in the streets, whole families, because they don't have the means to have a shelter. There has to be shelter, the basic necessity of life for everybody. Any movement that starts out has to deal with those questions. Everybody has to have a shelter. Everybody has to have the means to survive on a physical level. And then when we get those things accomplished, then we can take things to a higher level. Those are my concerns right now.
If you had one gift to give to the youth of today who are becoming politically aware, what would it be?
Knowledge of what went on before, so people don't fall back and make the same mistakes again. And that's one of the biggest problems I see today, the lack of continuity. I mean, people don't even know what happened last week, let alone know what happened 20 years ago. So any young organizations, people coming out there today, don't know about all the mistakes that we made. They're going to make the same things again. A lot of people don't believe that you can learn from past mistakes, but I don't believe that. If really we could pass on the knowledge on a mass level of what went on before, that would help those that are in a position to analyze and make decisions, see some of the things that shouldn't be done. Now, nobody has any answers to how to deal with this stuff today. Nobody's had to deal with it before. And you can see all the models that we so-called had before in the so-called progressive communist world have just fallen by the wayside because it was trying to be imposed from the top. And the people stayed where they were at. As soon as all those repressive measures by all the different regimes fell aside, what happened? All those ethnic struggles that were taking place 75 years ago had sprung out all over again. And all those eastern countries that we see, you know. And the whole thing we have to do, we have to write the whole thing all over again. And we have to start by dealing with coming up something to deal with the economic problems of all those millions of people out there suffering from not having any shelter and not having a means to eat and have health care. I feel that personally, one of the solutions is there needs to be a real, true party in the United States that represents the needs of the people. Another party that really, really addresses itself to the needs of the people has to come into being. There's just too many people out there suffering that wouldn't support it. You know, I feel that if it came along, anything that comes along that's really effectively dealing with the people's needs, the people are going to get behind it because the situation is terrible.
There are pastors still in prison: Geronimo Pratt, the New York Three, David Rice, Ed Poindexter, Robert F. Hayes, Romaine Chip Fitzgerald. There's a Panther on death row, Umir Abu-Jamal. There's Panthers in exile, Michael Settlewell Tabor, Peter O'Neill, George Brown, Asada Shakur, etc. Would you say there's a lot of unfinished business? And do you have any thoughts on what must be done?
Yeah, well, that's, like I say, there definitely is unfinished business. And the reason all these people are still in prison and having such a difficult time getting out is because of all these problems. Because the authorities know that people that already have experience, that have knowledge, if they can keep them off the streets, that's going to leave the people out there floundering around. They can't bring that experience and leadership to the struggle. So I feel that the maximum number of people that can be gotten together that have consciousness of what is the actual situation should get their heads together. The answers are not going to just fall out of the sky. We've got to get our heads together and have a brainstorming session and see what we can come up with to start dealing with that situation. I feel that's the first step. People have to get themselves together. Put all those ideologies and ideological struggle, who has the best line with words, out of the way. People are suffering. That has to be dealt with. All those ideological struggles that just be wasting time, people running their mouths trying to prove who's got the best line just with words, that has to be thrown in the garbage can. And all those megalomaniac men struggling for power or trying to get off their program, they got to be put into a museum of history. People have to get their heads together that have some kind of political consciousness to try to come up with some solutions and put them into action and see if we can start moving to get something going, to get some relief to the people. The people are suffering.
Is there anything else you would like to say?
Everybody's got any ideas to get some kind of relief to all those suffering people, move on it. Don't waste your time criticizing the others. If you got an idea, move on what you think is right. Stop spending your time knocking down the others because you don't agree with what they're doing. What's ending up, ain't nobody doing nothing.
Thank you.
Right on.